What began as a routine voyage quickly descended into a living nightmare of madness, cruelty and despair, as a chain reaction of incompetence led to the French frigate the Medusa becoming shipwrecked off the West African coast. In the chaos and panic that ensued, 147 of the survivors were abandoned and cast adrift on the raging open seas, clinging to a hastily assembled makeshift raft. With barely any food or water, and no compass to navigate, they fought to stay afloat as their new home was battered by relentless storms, while sharks menacingly circled in anticipation of their next meal. However, the greatest danger would not come from Mother Nature, but from the beast that lay within the hearts of every man aboard the raft. As over 14 days of insanity and suffering, the tormented survivors turned on one another in a vicious Darwinian struggle for survival that would see 90% of them perish, in what became one of the most horrifying tales in shipwreck history. A tale that demonstrates the dark depths to which man can plunge when he is pushed to the very limits of desperation. On the 18th of June 1815, 25 years of war and upheaval in Europe were finally brought to an end with Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. In the weeks and months that followed, the royal dynasty, which had been violently deposed by revolution, was restored to power as France became a monarchy once again under King Louis XVIII. The new king and his supporters immediately set to work resurrecting the old order, enacting swift retribution on their enemies as they mercilessly purged French society of Napoleon's supporters and appointed loyal royalists in their place. The mood in France was bleak, and her people were bitterly divided. Many still yearned to return to the glory days of the Revolution. As part of the peace treaty, the British agreed to return the port of St. Louis in the West African colony of Senegal as a gesture of goodwill, a port which had been seized from Napoleon during the war. On the 17th of June 1816, a triumphant convoy of 4 French ships set sail to Senegal to receive the British handover of the port and re-establish French control over the colony. The convoy was led by its flagship the Medusa, which carried over 400 passengers and crew, including the new French governor of Senegal and his wife, a host of French officials, settlers and scientists, 160 sailors, and a detachment of marines who were to serve as the port garrison. The deep splits in French society caused by Napoleon's rise and fall were vividly on display aboard the Medusa. The contrast between the low-born crew and the aristocratic officers and government officials couldn't have been more stark. The sailors and soldiers were hardened military veterans who had fought and bled for Napoleon, a rough assortment of orphans, petty thieves, and seasoned killers who deeply resented the restoration of a privileged aristocracy that they themselves had played a role in deposing. The hand-picked officers who ruled over the crew and soldiers were chosen not for their competence or experience, but merely based on their loyalty to the new king. The gulf that existed between the two groups on board the Medusa was vast, and would sow the seeds for the nightmare that was about to unfold. Commanding the flagship was the Viscount de Chaumareix, a minor aristocrat who hadn't been to sea in over 20 years, and who had been appointed solely as a reward for his loyalty to the king. Captain de Chaumareix was keen to reach his destination as quickly as possible, and made the decision to sail along the most direct route against the warnings of his experienced crew. This shorter route hugged the African coastline and passed through an area of ocean notorious for its dangerous sandbars and reefs. However, the impetuous captain refused to be swayed. The 3 other ships in the convoy wisely gave the perilous waters a wide berth, and the Medusa quickly lost contact with her escorts. She was now sailing alone in treacherous waters. The captain's reckless decision raised eyebrows amongst his already suspicious crew, and after the ship narrowly avoided crashing into a nearby reef, any confidence left in him vanished. It was now clear as day that the bumbling aristocrat was completely out of his depth. Captain de Chaumareix heard rumblings of discontent amongst his crew, and shaken by his near miss with the reef, decided to delegate navigation responsibilities to a subordinate. However, the old aristocrat could not bring himself to empower one of Napoleon's former followers. He instead chose a royalist passenger named Richfort as the new navigator, a man who claimed to be experienced with sailing ships, but in fact knew nothing. This bluff would quickly be called. As the captain retreated to the privacy of his cabin with his mistress, the new navigator mistook clouds on the horizon for Cape Blanco on the African coast, and based on this miscalculation, completely lost track of the ship's true location. Now 100 miles off course, the Medusa ran into increasingly shallow water. However, neither the captain nor the navigator spotted the muddy ocean floor becoming visible beneath the water, a sign which clearly indicated just how shallow the water was becoming. Then the inevitable happened. The Medusa crashed into a sandbank and came to a complete standstill 30 miles off the African coast. Despite suffering such a disaster, all hope was not yet lost. However, in yet another remarkable demonstration of his incompetence, Captain duse Shipwreck refused to jettison the ship's heavy 14 3-ton cannons. Ditching this unnecessary excess weight could have prevented the ship from sinking deeper into the mud and allowed the Medusa to float higher and escape her prison. However, the royalist captain couldn't bring himself to discard the valuable cannon, weapons that were the property of the king himself. This final mistake in a string of bad decisions finally turned the crew against him. The sailors and marines on board raided the ship's alcohol supplies and drank themselves into a drunken stupor, ransacking anything of value and even plundering the captain's quarters. Yet their mutiny went unpunished as the officers desperately tried to come up with a rescue plan. Discipline was on the verge of completely breaking down, as men who should have been working together to survive instead indulged their own selfish impulses, a disturbing glimpse into the horrors that would soon unfold. Permanently stranded 30 miles from the coast, the ship's officers realized that their only hope was to abandon ship and evacuate everyone in the lifeboats. However, since the lifeboats only had a total capacity of 250 people, 2 trips would be required to safely ferry all 400 souls on board to land. Unwilling to abandon the ship's precious cargo, which included the valuable possessions of some very important and powerful passengers, a makeshift raft measuring 66 feet long and 23 feet wide was constructed from wood planks salvaged from the ship. Nicknamed the Machine by the crew, this hastily built raft was intended to save as much of the ship's cargo as possible. The raft was supposed to be chained to the lifeboats and towed to safety along with the passengers and crew. However, as a fierce storm appeared on the horizon, the captain panicked. With raging seas battering the Medusa, she began to break apart and take on water. The terrified captain believed that the ship was in imminent danger of sinking. He announced that all of the passengers had to be evacuated as quickly as possible before the ship sunk. There was no longer enough time to make 2 separate trips ashore. The makeshift cargo raft was quickly repurposed to hold all of the passengers who wouldn't fit on the lifeboats. The plan was to tether the raft to the lifeboats and tow it ashore. However, the flimsy raft, which was little more than a few planks of wood precariously tied together, did not inspire confidence in those ordered to step aboard. This suspicion was compounded when it became clear that the governor, captain, and all of the wealthy and important passengers had miraculously been allocated places on the much safer lifeboats, along with their large, heavy chests filled to the brim with valuables. The 147 people herded at gunpoint onto the raft were drawn from the dregs of the crew and included expendable colonists, low-ranking sailors and soldiers, and a handful of officers who had fallen out of favour with Captain duse Shipwreck. In fact, the raft was in such bad shape that 17 men took one look at it and promptly chose to stay behind and take their chances on the sinking Medusa. To make matters even worse, after just 40 passengers boarded, the raft already started sinking, forcing them to ditch most of their vital supplies overboard to reduce weight and allow the other 107 waiting passengers to embark. By the time all 147 passengers had huddled onto the makeshift raft, many were already up to their knees in water, with those unlucky enough to be on the outer edges of the raft in constant danger of being pushed overboard by the heaving mass of bodies pressing against them. As the convoy departed, the lifeboat's rowers struggled to tow the weight of the semi-submerged raft, and progress slowed to a snail's pace, as it seemed as though the coastline was drifting further and further away. Exactly what happened next is still disputed, perhaps fearful that the raft passengers might attack and overwhelm them. or simply believing that they stood a much better chance of survival without the burden of towing the raft, those on board the lifeboats decided to cut the ropes binding their craft together, leaving the raft and its 147 inhabitants at the mercy of the open sea. Whatever their true motivations, this selfish act was almost certainly deliberate. When the people on the raft realized what was going on, they cried out to those on board the lifeboats for mercy. However, their cries were ignored, even though the lifeboats were well below capacity and laden with cargo, luxury goods and kegs of wine, which could have easily been discarded to make space for more passengers. As the lifeboats disappeared on the horizon, those stranded on the drifting raft realized that they were now on their own, yet their nightmare was only just beginning. Lacking oars, a rudder and any tools with which to navigate, the passengers only had a few barrels of wine and a meagre amount of biscuit, which had now been completely soaked by seawater. As they struggled to hold on to the unstable raft, they realized that if the sea didn't kill them, hunger and thirst would. Yet they would soon learn that their fellow passengers were the most immediate and dangerous threat. Anger at being abandoned by the lifeboats simmered, and many were convinced that they had been deliberately sacrificed. The mood on the raft turned sour as dark thoughts filled the passengers' minds. A makeshift sail was set up in the center of the raft where the officers were stationed, and as a strong storm blew in, ropes were attached to the raft to give the people something to hold on to. However, as night fell, little could be done to prevent the waves from sweeping away many of those on the outer edges of the raft. When the sun rose the next morning, 20 passengers were missing. The second day brought some respite in the form of calmer weather, with many of the soldiers and sailors now motivated by pure hatred, swearing to survive the ordeal so that they could take revenge on the lifeboat passengers. However, others instead surrendered to sheer hopelessness and despair, and chose to give up and throw themselves overboard rather than endure the torture anymore. It's easy to understand why. With just a handful of soaking wet biscuit to eat, the survivors had been standing in knee-deep water while clinging onto the raft for dear life, unable to sleep lest they fall overboard, while those who had sustained injuries were constantly tormented by fresh seawater pouring over their open wounds. It had only been 24 hours, yet the passengers were already exhausted, starving, and drained from living in constant fear. Yet as night fell for the second time, the real nightmare began. The rougher elements of the crew were men who had seen action in battles all over the planet, and were more often than not drawn from the lowest rungs of society, many of whom were former convicts, career criminals, and generally types considered to be undesirable. Without iron discipline to rein them in, their anger and lust for revenge could explode into violence at a moment's notice. As yet another stormy night began, many of the soldiers and sailors gave in to a chilling, fatalistic despair, believing that if they were going to die anyway, they might as well go out on their own terms. They forced open a barrel of wine, drank themselves silly, and in an alcohol-induced madness, decided to sabotage the raft and send themselves to the bottom of the sea, taking all of the other passengers with them. The officers gathered around the mast in the center of the raft, attempted to put down the insane rebellion, and what began as a fistfight quickly escalated into a lethal struggle for survival, as axes, blades, and bayonets were used to chop, stab, and slice. As this pitched battle unfolded on the raft, neutral passengers who tried to stay out of the fight were knocked overboard in the frenzied chaos as the two factions slaughtered each other without mercy. By the time dawn broke on the third day, only 60 of the original 147 passengers were still alive. With lifeless bodies piled high and dozens more thrown overboard, the blood-soaked raft now looked like a slaughterhouse. However, for those still breathing, this savage cull of the raft's population had eased the danger of imminent starvation, as the limited supplies were now shared between far fewer people. Yet despite this, the hunger was still intolerable. As the survivors eyed the fresh corpses, a thought sprang to their mind. Why let good meat go to waste? Some of the soldiers began feasting on the flesh of the fallen, while the others watched on in disgust, and although many refused to take part in the feasting on people who just hours earlier were crewmates, friends, and relatives, eventually irresistible hunger drove even the most reluctant survivors to partake in the gruesome banquet. Yet this intake of much-needed calories would only fuel further conflict, as the bitter civil war between the two factions resumed in earnest as the sun set and the third night began. In the darkness that followed, a further 30 men are thought to have been mercilessly slain, and by sunrise on the fourth day, just 20 men remained unscathed, with 10 others laying grievously wounded. By now, any mercy remaining in the hearts of the survivors had completely vanished, and it was decided that anyone injured should be disposed of to make the remaining food last as long as possible. The strong preyed on the weak, as anyone deemed to be wounded was unceremoniously thrown into the ocean. With fewer mouths to feed, the 20 survivors set about preserving the remaining meat, hanging it from the raft's rigging so that it would cure in the salt air, as the raft began to resemble a macabre open-air pantry. The remaining survivors hunkered down and awaited rescue or death as they baked under the relentless sun and were driven to the brink of insanity by thirst and hunger. For 13 more days they endured as the raft drifted on the seemingly infinite ocean. The men had given up on all hope and accepted that they would never see home again. However, with the survivors on the verge of death, a ship was spotted on the horizon. At first they assumed that the ship was merely a mirage or a figment of their now delirious imagination. However, as the ship sailed closer and closer, the ordeal was finally over. Salvation had arrived. Against all the odds, one of the 3 other ships that had accompanied the Medusa from France had found the tiny raft and its castaways, a feat which was like finding a needle in a haystack. The scene that greeted the rescue party was grim indeed. Half-eaten corpses were strewn across the raft's shabby, broken deck, and the stench of death filled the air, while those aboard who were still breathing appeared more like wild animals than men, their bodies emaciated, their beards long and overgrown, and their eyes now dark, hollow chasms. The ordeal had rendered the men mere husks of their former selves. The death toll was immense. Of the original 147 people on board the raft, only 15 were still alive. The bedraggled survivors were quickly taken off the raft and brought aboard the rescue ship, where they were given broth and wine in an effort to sustain them. However, 5 were beyond help and died shortly afterwards. Only 10 survivors of the original 147 made it home. The shipwreck caused a scandal back in Paris and became a powerful symbol of government incompetence and corruption, and highlighted the dangers of appointing people to important positions based merely upon their political loyalties. The embarrassed royalist government tried to suppress the more disturbing details. However, such a dark tale could not be covered up, no matter how hard they tried. Captain Chomeret and the passengers lucky enough to be on the lifeboats made it safely to Senegal. The captain soon returned to the location of the shipwreck, not to look for survivors, but to retrieve gold that was left on board. However, amazingly, he discovered that the ship was still intact, and 3 of the 17 men who chose to stay behind were still alive, after an incredible 54 days stranded on board. Back in France, the captain was court-martialed and found guilty of incompetent navigation and abandoning his ship before all of the passengers were safely evacuated. However, rather than receiving the death penalty, he got off with a relatively minor slap on the wrist and was sentenced to just 3 years in prison. The Navy was keen to sweep the entire episode under the rug and move on with business as usual. However, much to their dismay, a young artist was about to forever immortalize the full, sordid details of the disaster. The 27-year-old painter Theodore Géricault became obsessed with the ship and the nightmare that had unfolded on the raft known as the Machine, and set to work on capturing the tragedy in an enormous painting measuring 16 feet by 24 feet, making it not that much smaller than the raft itself. He conducted extensive research into the shipwreck, interviewing survivors, and even going so far as to visit morgues and study corpses to ensure that he could capture the skin color of the dead accurately. His resulting masterpiece is titled The Raft of the Medusa and can still be seen today at the same art gallery as the Mona Lisa, the horrifying scene on the raft that it depicts, perfectly capturing the suffering, despair, and nightmarish cruelty of one of the most infamous shipwrecks of the Age of Sail. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon.